Hello listeners and welcome to the latest episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast with me, Chris Holliday.
And me, Alex Sargent.
If we sound a bit different, a bit echoey, it's because we are recording this live at the Society for Animation Studies Conference 2025 Sustaining Animation that's being held at the London College of Communications. So we are currently holed up in a little room just off of the main event where we'll be recording, I think, probably about half a dozen of these. So you'll hear us echoey for a while.
The next 6 or 7 episodes that pop up that sound a bit echoey, that's where we record them.
This will be the reason why. Yeah. So we're very lucky in lots of ways to essentially have a roster of people that we can grab and who have very kindly given up their time to come and chat with us. So and today is no exception. Is the first episode that we record of this SAS 2025 batch, let's say. This is an episode where we're looking at somebody who should be written into, I think this will become clear, I think, as we start talking, a figure that should be really written into animation history. So T. Collins, who we will go into a bit more detail by virtue of their work, learn a bit about them and kind of their contribution to animation more broadly. So yes, I'm not going to say too much because I think our guest will do the job. We've got a couple of examples of work that they've done for at least one television program that people will recognise, Sesame Street. So we haven't done Sesame Street either. We've done Henson, but we've not really done Sesame Street. So this is a great opportunity to kind of do a bit of that as well. So yeah, I guess I'm slightly differently. I'm not going to say too much about who T. Collins is. I am, however, going to introduce our special guest. So I think T. Collins is somebody who we can manoeuvre across fantasy and animation, I would say. Lots of stuff to say, I think, from animation side on kind of animation history and visual style and stuff like that. Alex, anything to tease with fantasy before I introduce our guest?
I mean, I think we're going to talk about fairy tales, we're going to talk about magical scenarios, we're going to talk about illustration maybe.
Yes.
We'll see how we go in the relationship between illustration and fantasy, picture books, things like that. All fun stuff to talk about.
Lovely stuff, excellent. So it won't just be us, as I said, we are very grateful that the Society for Animation Studies has given us a suite of experts in a wide variety of fields. So we are delighted to welcome to the podcast Robby Gilbert, who is an animator, artist and historian of animation and moving images. He's worked as an animator for several years and has illustrated numerous works for children, so a kind of perfect segue into thinking about illustration, including The Adventures of Ranger Rick for the National Wildlife Federation. He's currently an assistant professor of animation at Rowan University and has recently completed a monograph, so depending on when you are listening to this, it'll either be floating out or it'll be imminent, or you might have it in your hand, for Palgrave, their animation series, titled City in Motion, Animation in New York, 1966 to 1999. So Robby, thank you ever so much for taking time out of the conference and chatting with us.
Thank you. Yeah.
So I guess we should start with quite an open question, which is who is
T. Collins?
Who is T. Collins? But I suppose it's really who is T. Collins in relation to animation history, because knowing what you're presenting actually at the conference and work that you're doing with Collins himself, you're trying to sort of introduce, is that fair to say, or to claim for his significance within animation history, animation studies?
That's an interesting question. I'm a native New Yorker, and when I learned of T. Collins myself, who I'd never heard about, having gone to school in New York and studied and worked in New York, I became fascinated with this person's story, and to some degree a little angry that it hasn't been told yet, frankly, just as a New Yorker. And because it's so germane to the study and the history of animation, I've sort of been involved with the Collins family, who've wanted to get the story out for years, and it's a story that really should have been out years ago. So,
So tell us the brief bit of the story. We've got an hour. Do it in a minute or two, and then we'll do it again for an hour. But what is this story, and why is it important that we know it?
T. Collins was the first black studio head in the United States. He began a studio, several of them, but T. Collins Productions, and that may not be the most important piece of his work. The most important piece of work is that he's the first Sesame Street animator. And in the history of animation, Sesame Street changed pretty much everything in the United States for animation. So Collins, being a pioneer of that form, that short form of educational stuff, is significant for many reasons. Yeah.
Okay, and I can see from your own biography, it speaks to some of the stuff you're working with, so I can totally see how it resonates. It's a story that I didn't know about until you suggested it for this episode, and again, angry with myself, actually, as one does for not knowing it, and all the politics surrounding why we might not know it. Perhaps we'll get into as we go, in terms of who gets to be written into history and who doesn't.
Well, I was just going to jump in, looking at the at the risk of immediately derailing the conversation. But hey, you've put in your summary, your abstract for the talk, that T. Collins sort of sits alongside Jim Simon, Dan Haskett as these kind of quote unquote Harlem animators. So it'd be really good to hear what that kind of context.
I think it's one of the most fascinating pieces of this. So I was born in '66. I'm the first Sesame Street generation.
Okay.
And I grew up in New York on the Upper West Side, and so I remember Sesame Street from my childhood. What I didn't realize until researching these animators is that Sesame Street is born in Harlem.
Right.
Because Joan Gans Cooney, who was the executive producer of Sesame Street, specifically was seeking out animators from Harlem because Sesame Street was targeted towards children from inner city environments who were not reading at a level of white children, basically. So I didn't realize that Sesame Street was targeted at Harlem. It's set in Harlem, even though it was shot in Newark, but it's set on a street. And that, I think, is a significant piece of the history. And she met T. Collins because T. Collins was very active in not only animation, but in Harlem youth organizations, where her husband was head of. So this amazing connection between Harlem and Sesame Street, which has become a worldwide phenomenon, obviously, is just a story that is long overdue to be really told. And so there's that. But this is really about the history of history in a lot of ways, because we haven't heard about T. Collins.
Yeah.
And T. Collins started out as he was a painter, fine artist, very much in the Afro-Cubism style. But in order to feed a family, started to take on commercial work in New York. Now, New York in the 50s is a commercial town. It's the advertising town. So we know all about Hollywood, but New York is very vibrant. In fact, New York is where the American animation industry begins. So T. Collins takes on commercial work, and he starts working for UPA Studios as a designer for beer commercials. And John Hubley hires him, and John Hubley hires another African-American named Wardell Gaynor. And so John Hubley famously had been blacklisted for his leftist, quote, leanings, was a big fan of jazz and was not afraid to hire African-Americans. The ugly part of the history, of course, is that black animators did not exist during this time. Women animators did not exist during this time. So for Hubley to bring in these artists who were fantastic was really an important moment. What the Sesame Street people learned from their research in how to teach children literacy was that maybe children couldn't read or count to 10, but they could all sing, very specifically, beer commercials. So there's that connection from beer commercials to Sesame Street. So at the time, according to Phyllis Feinstein, who wrote a great book called All About Sesame Street, Sesame Street was the most researched program in television history at the time. And after a year or two of research on how to use television to educate children, because public broadcasting in the United States had just become a thing, they found that using commercials to teach was a very effective method. So basically, those numbers and letter segments, they are commercials for letters. They are literally commercials for numbers. And that paradigm of repetition and commercials formed the basis for that educational animation. And they knew right away that they needed animation for it, and T. Collins was the first.
Can we go back a little bit? I think that was hopefully listeners who've never heard of T. Collins now get a sense of the important role he played in Sesame Street, the development of that format that even, I also grew up on Sesame Street, and I can remember that, this is brought to you by the letter, today's episode is brought to you by the letter C and the number, or whatever it was. All of that I can remember really fondly, and it's amazing to learn his central role in creating that kind of really innovative format. I'm also slightly poignantly thinking about kind of, the current literally demise of sort of PBS and its move to Netflix and some of the issues that might do in terms of who it can reach and who it can't reach. But that's an aside note. Can we just get the story? How do we get to this point where this guy's arrived at Sesame Street? Because I guess I'm asking a bunch of questions. I'm checking myself to see why I'm asking them, because why wouldn't he get there? But we've got a kid born in Harlem. Was it?
He was born in New Bern, North Carolina, in
right,
1923.
Okay, 1923. So right. So North Carolina born African American kid becomes a cubist painter, also doing commercials. Just tell us a bit more of how we go from A to B there.
Very major piece of history. So 1923 is right smack in the dab of what's called the Great Migration, which at the time was the largest movement of human bodies ever. And that's when the huge population, millions of African Americans left the South, the Jim Crow racism of the South, to find work in the North. And so Collins and his family were part of that. So they moved when he was very young to New York, and they did settle in Harlem. And at the time, Harlem was a vibrant center of jazz music, of literature, of African-American intellectualism, and an important cultural hub in a country that was otherwise very exclusive of African-American point of views for the most part. And so Collins grows up here in this very creative community and begins to draw. And he begins to play basketball. I think the basketball part is important to this because, Triplets of Belleville, I think, is surrounded by basketball. There's all kinds of motion in there, movement studies, mechanics, and as I'll try to uncover, Collins looks at animation very intellectually. And I think by studying Collins and Jim Simon, for that matter, we can maybe somehow tease out some parcels about movement itself, about animation theory itself, that had not really been thought of by the more well-known animators at the time. And I think that's also a huge part of it as well. Collins comes to New York and he plays basketball on scholarship. He goes to Long Island University on a basketball scholarship and then gets drafted to World War II. And finds a way out of the army as a pacifist very early. He was honorably discharged, but I think that part of the story is a little bit vague about how he gets himself out of military service. And he comes back to New York, and he goes to Cooper Union. Now, that's an important piece, too, because at the time, Cooper Union is a very prestigious school. They have many filmmakers there of import, and he absorbs himself into the intellectual conversation of filmmaking and cinema and painting and art, and he studies graphic design there. Finds work at the Hubley Studios, Electra Studios, so some of the legendary studios of New York at the time, and this is all Madison Avenue stuff, right? So this is not features. At that time, we still hadn't had a feature film done in New York. And so he's working in advertising and commercials where he develops multiple styles, because working in commercials means you have to adapt to the different clients all the time. And he works very much with Peel's Beer, the Bert and Harry characters, very stylized, very UPA, you can see in the look of them. Yeah. And he becomes very fast at it. And so that simplified commercial style lends itself to Sesame Street very well, because Sesame Street, even though they had a large budget, initially they had to churn out a lot of animations very, very quickly. So so the whole aesthetic was commercial, fast animation, and adopting that aesthetic. This letter is brought to you by this episode brought to you by the letter W, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
Okay. So should we talk about limited animation at this point, Chris?
Well,
or
yes.
You want to do it, or should I?
Yeah, no. I've got. It's funny you should say that.
Yeah.
One of my notes. I mean, we'll get to the actual examples themselves. But I suppose, and I've written this note in relation to the last example that you gave, which we'll get to before we've kind of gone through the career. I've written a version of limited animation, and I've got a bit. Watching some of the stuff, it's a bit anime, but it's a bit Ralph Bakshi, but it's also backgrounds are being moved, but it's also illustrative, and it reminds me of like the footage that you see of Tim Burton's work at Disney, which didn't quite fit with the Disney aesthetic, these kind of drawings, these line pencil drawings. But I'm interested in what you said about fast animation, because that seems to me different. Limited animation is often considered in a specific kind of way. Dan Bashara's book on UPA and that sort of modernist, that's like that mid-century modernism. There are reasons why, aesthetic reasons, economic reasons as to why limited animation is limited and what we mean by this term. But it seems like fast animation is something else. It's not just limited animation. Fast animation seems to be giving us something else, because the fastness speaks to, because you get this a lot with like the South Park, like the animation needs to be like that because it's fast, because it's topical and it's reactive, and something like Sesame Street, you're saying that it's not, because you haven't really used limited animation, you use fast animation. So I find that quite an interesting maybe way of thinking about a different set of preoccupations. Limited animation is this broad thing that encaptures a lot of different things. Well, actually, fast animation gets us thinking maybe about audience and purpose and some of the stuff that Malcolm Cook says about useful animation. So yeah, fast animation, limited animation. I'm trying to get my head around these, a potential conflict as much as a complementary kind of quality. I love the idea of fast animation.
I think that's a really interesting point too. Well, New York is not a studio town for the most part. There were some advertising studios, but New York, Sesame, it's not a big studio town like a Hanna-Barbera or I mean, you had Fleischer Brothers, but by the end of the 60s, Fleischer's, Paramount, all that stuff, Terry Toons were out.
Yeah.
So by 1968, those studios were essentially defunct, living off their libraries. So in 1968, when you didn't have women animators, you didn't have African American animators, Sesame Street comes along, and these animations are being done in apartments. They're being done in the small back rooms of New York City apartments. In T. Collins' case, in a Harlem tenement building, basically. So without the benefit of pencil tests, for the most part, and done on 16 millimeter film rather than 35 millimeter everything. And of course, New York had a very large film processing center, which was in Hell's Kitchen at the time. So it's a very seedy scene, frankly. We're talking about pornography, we're talking about mafia, we're talking about all kinds of stuff integrated into the scene that isn't quite as wholesome as Disney was supposed to be. And also a lot of people who did commercials were artists. They were just doing that to feed, not that animation isn't an art, but they were using that to feed their families or feed their habits for getting paint and stuff like that. But also people like a John Hubley could animate commercials because they weren't credited and he was blacklisted. So this is an important point. So African American animators and some women could work as animators out of their bedrooms, out of their studios in New York in a way that couldn't happen in Hollywood. Plus you have this New York kind of aesthetic, which has been written about in a number of ways, as opposed to a Hollywood aesthetic. So getting to fast animation. So in order to make money, to make a living, these artists had to churn out commercials very, very quickly. They were topical. The agencies needed to have these out. And same for Sesame Street. They realized that they needed a lot of these animations. And the beauty of it is that this is where so many independent animators get their first start. So many women get their start doing Sesame Street work, and it becomes a lifeline for animation in New York, for sure.
Yeah, well, it's funny you talked about credits, and maybe this is a good opportunity as well to delve into the examples. But I did notice, I'm still not going to say the example name, I'm just going to tease it, but I was struck by the difference, that kind of anonymity, that kind of political anonymity, that kind of race-based anonymity versus that I think in the last example, Collins is credited as director, producer, storyboard artist, and animator, and it's really interesting to see these two. I want to say 20 years between kind of some of the examples. We're sort of dealing with the first example from the late 60s and then the 1990s. So this is a kind of period in which he's moving from these short Sesame Street. What did he? How long was he at Sesame Street before he kind of?
He animated. I have a letter from Joan Gans Cooney that talks about him being the first Sesame Street animator and animating for about 20 years for Sesame Street. So, while he's doing various other things as well, he's taking on these Sesame Street jobs, many for overseas Spanish language Sesame Street, and so forth. So he was a part of that family of animators throughout his career until he began teaching. In 1968 in the United States, we have we're right in the middle of the civil rights movement. We're right in the middle of riots, race riots. T. Collins was very proud to be a black man and very much had no interest in hiding that. And he had very much a political interest, I guess, in advancing the black aesthetic and African aesthetic, and challenging what can no doubt be described as the rampant racism that existed in animation at the time. And so he was very disillusioned with the portrayal of a lot of especially racial stereotypes. And so when you look at Wanda the Witch, for example, he made a deliberate choice to not give her any color. And the challenge there is that sometimes you see it, through the lines, which is not done. You have to block off the backgrounds. You can't bleed through in a cell animation. But Collins says, well, why not? And so he's very concerned throughout his career that African Americans not be portrayed as villains all the time, or people of color as villains. So,
Well, you've teased the first example.
So for Sesame Street, sorry, I was lost in that answer.
Yes, I'm sorry. I've been writing things down, but you won't believe, Alex.
There's so the first example you've given us to watch. I mean, we'll try and put a link to the beer commercial you mentioned earlier, because I think that's a useful early start to it. But the one we're going to talk about a bit more today is, so this is the first animation he did for Sesame Street?
This is the first animation Sesame Street commissioned.
It's even more emphatic than that, right?
Yeah, and my follow-up question to that is this a recurring, you mentioned Wanda the Witch, is this a recurring character?
Wanda the Witch isn't, but he also did Nanny the Nanny Goat.
Yeah, and that is
So it was sort of a pattern of letter teaching.
But the kind of the Wanda the Witch, it's like a minute and a half long, and it's brought to us by the little W, and it's a kind of gag, isn't it? That the whole thing is, what does she do?
Alliterative.
She is a weasel. She goes to a well. The
wig of worms.
The wig of worms. Yeah. So it's all kind of the whole plot is things that start with the letter W.
Makes sense.
So there's so many ways to attack this. I'm just trying to kind of follow on from your previous question about the kind of the politics of it, because I'm also interested. There's I guess the identity politics that will fuel his work, which is trying to, at the very least, be a positive force in a kind of history of black stereotypes in animation. And how we can at least just not do that and do something a bit different and not continue to kind of reassert those things. And then there's also seems to be a kind of almost class-based politics rooted in his kind of black identity, which is these are educating young inner city kids, of which a lot of them are going to be from ethnic minorities, because that's the kind of demographic makeup of these things. So I guess I'm tossing you a ball here to bounce a bit in the kind of style of basketball, but how does that feed into kind of his motivation and his design of these cartoons? You mentioned it kind of a bit earlier in the podcast, but they're designed around trying to there's this whole idea of using advertising principles to educate. Riff on that for me, if you don't mind.
Well, yeah, it's a big piece of the puzzle for sure. T. Collins was very active in his community in Harlem, not just as a basketball player, but as an organizer of youth athletics, of the arts and so forth. And of course...
Very busy man. Very busy man.
Very busy man. had a growing family, and he was disappointed, I think, not to be a painter. I've got some great examples of his paintings. In fact, the Smithsonian has just started collecting them, which is another interesting piece of the puzzle. But he initially didn't know, that wasn't his initial impulse to go into animation, but his impulse towards education and the arts for Black youth was important. It's what attracted Cooney to him. Plus, he was, I don't use this word lightly, he was brilliant. He was thinking all the time about movement, about messaging, about design style, about the impact of media on children. And at the time, there was this belief that inner city children were not reading very well. And I hate to say it, but there was this sort of belief that they were not as intelligent as white children. And this batch of studies comes out that T. Collins becomes aware of that shows that, and these are studies based on Boykin's theories, we could talk about them a little bit more, where what they were finding was that absolutely this was untrue, that African Americans were less intelligent. They find that culturally, the African American community learned much differently. And it's based around movement. Basically, the white kids had been trained to sit still in a row and repeat and repeat and repeat this sort of indoctrination. Whereas African American culture had more dance, had more movement, had more mythology and rhythm and things like that. And so what was found and what T. Collins was trying to tap into was that how can we address these learning disparities, which are not brain chemical or neural based or evolutionary based. They're based in culture, and how people learn. And what they found was that dance and movement and athletics and running around and during education was very much more conducive to the African American cultural point. So I think as an animator, that speaks to me, because when you look at the work of Collins and Jim Simon in particular, who was a protege of Collins, they don't move like anything you see today. And I don't want to criticize the way things move today so much, but to me, there seems to be one way that these facial expressions seem to move, and it seems to be more cookie cutter. And when you look at, say, Jim Simon's I Remember commercial, which is amazing, and you look at the way that little girl walks out the door, she dances, she moves in a way, and he very much, and so was T, looking at people like James Brown, jazz musicians. They were trying to tap into a whole nother aesthetic as a way of approaching movement, but also using that towards educational ends.
So it occurs to me then that there's a kind of knotty theoretical potential contradiction in this example that we can work through a little bit. So listeners, by all means, pause the podcast at this point and watch Wanda the Witch. Because if you haven't seen it before, because...
they are on YouTube. We'll put the links to it. They're available. And that's another element to this, which is it's interesting that they're available on YouTube, but we
absolutely, quite. Which is that, and I'm all of what you said I've written down because it reminded me watching it of like nonsense poetry, right? So kind of Edward Lear, Lewis Carroll, kind of the pleasure isn't necessarily in the sense of the story, the pleasure is in the nonsense of the story, right? She's got a belt, is it a belt made of weasels? Or it's something like, none of it makes any sense. And that's the pleasure of it. And it started making me thrash around with arguments that happen in sort of fantasy scholarship around kind of the role of visual in the fantastic, in kind of creating the fantastic. And it's a well-rehearsed argument, and unsurprisingly, as someone who focuses on the moving image, one I don't have a huge amount of truck with, which is this idea that really it's in written form that the fantastic thrives, right? So if you see a nonsense poem, you can see the pleasure of language and you're really enjoying that. But as soon as you start to try and literalize that by creating these images, you've taken away the imaginative element, because the readers are creating the images for themselves, whilst when we're watching it, we're just seeing it, aren't we? Which, you know, I don't have a huge amount of time for, because quite a lot of what I've tried to do in some of my work is talk about the imaginative process of seeing, and how seeing is as much a playful imaginative act as reading. All of that said, as a precursor to this, I'm trying to find a way to talk about how these feel nonsensical as you're watching them. And I think a lot of what the language you're using about fast and kinetic animation is part of the pleasure of it. And I guess the paradox then is, if people watch this, a lot of it doesn't move, does it? A lot of it is kind of one still image to another still image, rapid jumps from like one scene to another. But within that, there's this kind of kineticism, and there's this kind of freedom of movement that seems to be happening, that I think visualizes the nonsense really wonderfully. That it's drawn chaotically in the same way it's written chaotically, it is drawn chaotically. I don't know. Yeah.
Was that the seeing through you mentioned earlier on? The sort of lines you can see through, seeing through the lines. So is that part of it? Is that the kind of the colorlessness?
I think if you look at Wanda the Witch as a classically trained animator, you're going to go, this is, you know, what is this? This is not, you know, there's no squash and stretch. There's no 12 principles, right?
I have a question about the 12 principles. I'll ask you after this.
Yeah, don't get me started on that.
No, I will get you started.
But it's kind of like classical music as well. You know, it's sort of this initial reaction towards jazz music or hip hop music. I think. You know, to me, it's less nonsense that it's more jazz-like. It's more freeform, right? Yeah, and so bringing this sort of jazz aesthetic to it, one can, I think, appreciate it. I think, I haven't done a deep dive on, the trajectory of stylistic growth in Collins, although I do have some interesting things to share about that.
Sure.
But, this is the first Sesame Street commercial, and so I think Collins grows as an animator, through that career as well. This was just about teaching and repeating, because that commercial, Wanda the Witch, showed twice in the inaugural episode. So repetition was also part of it, right? To like repeat a commercial and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah. On the issue of squash and stretch, one of the notes I had, I guess, was more of actually a methodological question, which was the tension between, and I'll say it, I'll just say it, and then we can, which is the sort of the tension between kind of overclaiming Collins's blackness as a rationale for aesthetic choices, which is often how kind of this aesthetic must be about blackness, because, well, in a way that whiteness isn't ever claimed for. Whiteness is just, you don't watch a film by a white director and go, this is just all about whiteness, isn't it? It's as Richard Dyer would say, it's about class. It's about 50 other things before it's about whiteness.
It's assumed it's about whiteness.
Yeah. Whereas, and this is writing, whether you're talking about the sort of new black renaissance of the late, the Spike Lee and blaxploitation, it's the sort of, there's a sort of a tension between overclaiming blackness as the rationale for the way something looks that is different, versus using that generatively to say, well, the illusion of life is absolutely about, this is whiteness codified through a series of principles that have very specific ways of thinking about the body and the able body and the beautiful body, and so it's I just wondered whether or not it's a tension, or is it not a tension at all, to kind of locate yourself between using this work to critique the way that we've actually previously understood movement, because absolutely what you said, drawing on basketball, thinking about James Brown and jazz and that sort of improvisation or free form, there's that as a way to critique the way that we've understood movement, through the formula of Disney, versus the other extreme, which is attributing everything that's quote unquote different about his work to his blackness. So I just wondered, is that a problem that you wrestle with?
Of course, the whole being a white guy talking about black animators is a problem.
Sure, yeah, no.
And fortunately, Dr. Barbara Collins, T's daughter and granddaughter, who worked with T, have encouraged me to continue with this story.
Yeah.
And I also, you got to talk about John and Faith Hubley as well, who made films about Harlem, and so. Looking at those sort of different stylistic approaches to movement and style and Prestopino's paintings and things like that as well.
So I suppose it's important that we claim before we can even overclaim. We need to claim. We need to say that this is important and it's different for all the reasons that you've mentioned, all the sort of different aesthetic choices. We need to claim for something as important before we let people in 20 years' time overclaim.
Well, let me read to you a letter that it's at the Schomburg Center for Black Research in Harlem, where there is a small amount of T. Collins's work, and where I found this letter.
Amazing. This is, amazing.
Okay.
I love, as someone that's sat in an archive looking at letters, I love it when people have found the letter.
This is a handwritten letter.
Oh, it's handwritten, everyone.
Handwritten letter.
The lapsed historian in Alex is rising to the surface.
Yes, on yellow pad paper, right?
Yeah.
And it's to his daughter, Barbara. And Barbara, for a while, and Dr. Barbara Collins, for a while was his manager, but also she's the historian who knows about him. Anyway, here's the letter. Barbara, I produced for the vegetable soup program 10 3-minute animated spots. The subject of these spots falls under ethnic games. The main character, the villain, is called Spoil Sport. The voiceover for this character was created by actor James Earl Jones. Kids will find this character interesting to watch for this reason. His flesh color changes almost continuously 6 times for every second throughout each of the film segments. I used this technique in one of my TV commercials, and the results were successful. I feel that kids are as sophisticated as adults, so I feel that the artistic touch will also stimulate their imagination. With the flesh color constantly changing, the audience cannot identify the villain with any particular ethnic group.
Right.
Great, huh? I'm a genius just like you.
Wow.
Okay, cool. So actually quite a lot so it sounds like, I find this interesting, is that if we can identify any, we can identify some politics in his animation, but it seems to be actually, it's not so much about asserting blackness per se as it is about trying to remove negativities around race and ethnicity in general, right? You said that technique of having Wanda as a non-coloured character in the kind of true sense of the word, and this idea of let's let it be all races. It's about it's more of an act against something than it is like
a kind of de-emphasizing. Is that like a de-emphasizing of whiteness by having a sort of colourless, as you said earlier on, these...
I think it's de-emphasizing of ethnicity.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a de-emphasizing of ethnicity. That's what I was struggling to say.
Yeah, and yes, Collins was very... He did not like Disney. He would not work for Disney. He would not have anything to do with it. He wouldn't even take his daughter to Disneyland because the racism he felt by the company, this is his opinion.
Yeah.
And in those films, and Nicholas Salmon's book is really a great place to start looking at the birth of an industry, of course, that so many of those tropes, Mickey Mouse and so forth, are minstrels. Collins didn't really go that far to believe that, but he understood Disney to be a place that didn't hire African Americans. Sure. Yeah. So for that reason alone, he was not willing to support that whole thing. But yeah, if you think about this, it's from an animator's point of view, a character whose flesh color changes 6 times every second, so we're talking about 3, on 3s basically. Mm-hmm. What an amazing intellectual, I don't know if it quite works if you look at those spots of vegetable soup. I don't know if it works aesthetically. It's certainly not what we're used to, but it's such an intellectual leap, I think, and it's I think a valuable one for animators to consider, or illustrators, or those working in children's media.
Yeah. It is in terms of the style. So you sent us Wanda the Witch from the late 60s, and then Nancy the Nanny Goat. There's quite a coherent style across those two perhaps less so in the third example, which we'll get to, Songhai Princess. But it seems like well, would it be fair to say that when you're watching Sesame Street and you could pick out Collins's work, did it kind of stay relatively uniform across this period at Sesame Street? Because I think the style, I've written, for Nancy the Nanny Go, I've written kind of a similar style in a positive way, kind of almost unfinished. I don't want to de-emphasize his work, but obviously it's using some of the familiar tropes, let's say, around anthropomorphism, of course, and voiceover. And I've made a little note around sort of the lightning sketch as well. I think the sort of rapid, presto drawings, that sort of stuff. Is it fair to say that there is that coherency is true across? Like, we could identify a Collins kind of authorial style, or is it a little bit more complex than that?
For me, it's a little more complex because I think if we look at the work of Jim Tyre or some of the Fleischer animators, you can kind of pick out this is Tex Avery, this is so forth. And historically, that has been, I mean, even the terminology we're using to discuss animation is born out of a language that excludes the T. Collins of the world.
Yes,
right?
sure.
So for me, I can't really answer that question because I think it would take a number of years just watching all of his work. And I've been in touch with Children's Television Workshop. These films, the prints they don't exist anymore. No one knows where they are. So to put together a retrospective of T. Collins, all of his work, I think that's another thing that's great about, I think, this project, because it's so many people out there could research this and it's grounds for so much more scholarship, I think. Yeah. So is there a stylistic?
Maybe doing him a disservice to do it in those very sort of auteurist,
I think so. And if you look at his paintings, they're very different, very colorful, whereas those animations are more muted and things like that.
Yeah. I guess it also it begs the question and that would make them, not that you meant this, Chris, at all, but and if they all stood out as being particularly Collins, that would make them good, because surely the assignment...
They're worth preserving now.
As part of being part of the, as you said back when we talk about advertising, that's part of the agency of his work, is to fit within these, it has to be a Sesame Street animation as well as, it can't be something that transcends the thing. That part of doing the work is making it not transcend the thing, right?
I suppose I was just struck by the lack of colour on the examples, given I would have assumed prior to watching the work that an animated segment in a program like Sesame Street attracted to children is going to be colourful and it's going to do something, knowing what I know about, I grew up, I have watched Sesame Street and I can think of some of the kind of musical performances, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all that sort of stuff. I feel that's, I don't know, I don't know what I was expecting, but I'm sort of intrigued by the educational stuff, the fact they're line drawings, the sort of rhetorical quality that I've always banged on about, what Paul was would talk about, the kind of commitment to the idea. It just gives you enough of what you need and lets the imagery sort of take over. Also, I quite like the grotesqueness to the witch, but anyway, there's also, so I'm sort of intrigued by this sort of twisting of some of the qualities of animation.
But I think you're like Robbie in the sense that what Chris and I are both tripping over our words is that all the words we're trying to use are built on a vocabulary that are exactly the problem rather than the solution, aren't they? In the sense that
he's not doing anthropomorphism.
Unfinished compared to who said they have to be finished in a way that this one isn't. This one lacks colour. Does it have to have colour? All this kind of stuff.
So if you look at Wanda the Witch, particularly, it is a color film. It is shot in color. So obviously he could have used it, right? He made a very deliberate choice. To use it that way. He also used his granddaughter and just anybody to ink and paint these, and so he wasn't able to afford amazing New York City artists or things like that.
But it's funny that the stuff about the choice, obviously animation, as Wells would say, is the ultimate auteurist medium, because everything is a choice. And it seems like everything is a choice until you're talking about different animators and you go, well, they're missing something, aren't they? They must not have been trained. And there's the idea of animation being a choice is often a rhetoric that's forgotten when we're talking about non-white animators or animators where there must be a reason for why things are unfinished, or there must be you're sort of trying to claim and make sense of it rather than just, as you said, well maybe that's just how it was, or that's how unfinished. We're not unfinished as itself for this kind of loaded term. So I'm really interested in the way that the idea that everything is a choice seems to be less or made less true when we're dealing with.
Paul's been on the podcast, big fan of Paul's work and things like that. But I think that there's a little naivety to that phrase in the sense that everything, and when we started this podcast, I knew next to nothing about animation. Now I know a little bit more than nothing. But every single animator we've ever spoken to, every single person from the industry ever spoken to, makes me believe that this is the most collaborative, least auteurist art form there is, and usually that's because it's inherently, it's so labor intensive. So you can have the choice to do it all yourself if you're happy to, if you have the conditions and the willpower and all the other things that you need, and the money, exactly, and the time to do it all yourself. But if you haven't got that, you have to collaborate and you have to work, and that can be part of the choice as well, I guess.
Well, if I could follow up on that thread,
Of course you can.
I think that's a really important point. When we're talking about New York animation, we have Sesame Street comes out, T's the first, who does animation for Sesame Street. Jim Henson also did a lot of animation for Sesame Street, which we don't talk about Henson the animator, but that's a whole nother podcast.
Let's get you on to do that. Because sure.
But T is the first to do that. And so what you have in New York is all these auteurs, all these independent animators. They're not working for the studio. They're not working for Disney. They're not in California working in the machine. Fleischer is gone, so the New York studios are gone. So you have small advertising agencies, and they start to grab the aesthetic from graphic designers. And so they bring in all of these more modern type sensibilities, which the classically animators hated that for the most part, from what I understand. They really hated that. So Sesame Street is based in research in training children. What comes next out of New York, out of that? Well, you get MTV. MTV is these independent animators, probably 90% of them, myself included, animated for MTV, but also animated for Sesame Street, because we're independent animators.
Yeah.
Then out of that, the money that comes out of MTV, you get Liquid Television, independent animation showcase. You also get the Spike and Mike, you get all this sort of auteur animation coming through. Then you get Nickelodeon. What is Nickelodeon? Nickelodeon was to try to make good TV for kids. So Semensky and the people who did all this stuff looked to Cooney, Geraldine Laybourne particularly, to research styles and methods that Sesame Street did. So they were sort of following in that Sesame Street footprint.
Yeah, so there's a real through line.
There's a through line here. Yeah. This is sort of a big piece of the book I just wrote. I don't really want to plug it just yet, or we can, but it's besides the point.
Throughout whenever you like.
Plug it and we'll cut it out.
So, there's this through line from the independent animators, and Semensky particularly, they wanted to, and Geraldine Laybourne, who became one of the most powerful women in animation, they wanted to empower women animators who were independent, who were not given chances in studios, black animators, people who had traditionally not been in there. So you get this whole aesthetic that comes out of New York, viewpoints from female animators and so forth, that becomes Nickelodeon, it becomes Doug, it becomes Ren and Stimpy, who work for Bakshi, who's a classic Harlem associated.
That's why I said Bakshi. Anyway,
and Jim Simon started out his career with Bakshi, which is another amazing story, which we don't have time for.
So Collins is absolutely, busy, as you said, but from a historical perspective or a historian's perspective,
he's essential.
He's essential,
He's essential. Yeah, because then after that, you get the people from Nickelodeon, including Semensky and Betty Cohen, who create Cartoon Network. And so this whole history of auteur animation comes out in New York. It comes out of Sesame Street, arguably. It comes out of the need for independent animators who were working in commercials at the time. You probably couldn't get that out of Hollywood, you know. And it starts, I think, with Hubley, who was just cast out of Hollywood, and and so yeah, so it's just a fascinating story.
Yeah.
I hate to shift back into host mode, but I'm aware that we've only told a bit of this story so far, and we're rapidly running out of time. So
a whole other
we've
example.
We've got a whole other post Sesame Street thing to talk about. So he works for Sesame. Fill in the gaps. He works for Sesame Street for about 20 years. Did you say?
Off and on, for sure.
And then what does he do after that? Take us to our final example, Songhai Princess.
Which is 1990. Songhai Princess.
Yeah. So he had some setbacks. Okay. I haven't talked to anyone who knows either Jim Simon, who's very open about his setbacks and the racism in the industry. That was very discouraging. Collins faced some setbacks. But Collins is part of the first cohort of computer animators at School of Visual Arts. He gets a master's in computer animation or computer graphics at the time from School of Visual Arts at the age of 64, 65.
Wow.
And then he becomes a professor of animation, first in Ohio and then at University of Central Florida. So there are students of Collins who are taking this out there. But he did continue to work. And in 1990, based on those Boykin theories that we were talking about before about children's education and movement, wanted to create the Songhai Princess. And it's about this culture that, as white America, we probably don't know as much about, but one of amazingly great culture in Central African continent. And it's sort of low budget. You can see, it's sort of I guess we can call it limited animation by that kind of thing. But he's attempting to tell the story of the culture of Africa in that type of stuff. So he remains very committed to this thing. He started to write a book about black animators. The Schomburg has the list he has. It has 7 names on it. And that alone, I think, tells you a lot, okay? We could name them on 2 hands, right, at the time of black animators. And so that's a big piece of the puzzle as well. Okay. And to finish your question, if I may.
Oh, you may.
Colin's sister, Eva, tells a story of Collins becoming more well-known in the industry. And although they don't say who the executives were, some Hollywood executives were coming to New York to ask Collins to do a large multi-million-dollar project. And at the time, Collins lived in a cold water flat in Harlem, which was like a 4-story walk-up or something like that. And in those years, Harlem was not a nice place to be, particularly rundown. And so his sister, who lived on the Upper West Side, who had a nicer apartment, begged him to bring those clients to the Upper West Side, overlooking the Hudson River, and to present an aesthetic of a studio that had some money or some power to it. And Collins characteristically refused. He said, "This is who I am." And he brought those executives up to his Harlem apartment. He didn't get the job, but that's how committed he was to his roots and his own way of being in the world.
Amazing. Just because I want to do justice to this Songhai Princess, I've got loads of questions about the film itself. But just a little bit of context, a bit more. So what's it commissioned for? Is it a completely independent piece he made himself?
He was working with organizations that were trying to promote Black history. And he and his daughter at the time, Dr. Barbara Collins, was sort of his manager at the time as well. And so they got this commission to do this piece, but it was very low budget, obviously. And there wasn't a huge market for it, obviously, as well, unfortunately, at the time.
Okay, so it didn't... Because actually, I was watching it on the YouTube, and there was loads of comments from people going, God, I remember, obviously having, Proustian moments from their childhood, remembering this thing.
I've seen those comments, for sure. And it did show in certain markets, in certain areas,
Okay, so, the cartoon is... cartoon... One of all these words that one has to go, is that the right word for it? But this cartoon, for want of a better word, it tells the story of the Songhai Princess. And this Is this adapted from a particular Central African folklore, or is it kind of an amalgamation?
It's sort of an amalgamation, to my understanding, and I don't pretend to be an expert on African folklore.
Nor indeed do I.
But I think from what I read from Collins and what I know from spending time with Dr. Barbara and her daughter Monique, is that they were passionate about this project because the Songhai Empire was one of the most lucrative, richest, powerful empires in human history. And yet, what do we hear about? We hear about British Empire, we hear about, the Romans, we hear about all this kind of stuff. So they were very, in their move to push forward the cultural history, wanted to get this forward.
Because it's interesting, because the basic spine of the story, if people watch the example, which they'll be able to find, pause the podcast now. This one's about half an hour though, so do make yourself a cup of coffee first. When they watch it, there will be reminiscence, those who are Disney fans, of at least Disney's treatment of Sleeping Beauty. So we get the kind of birth of the child, or the announcement of the child at the beginning. You get a kind of witch arriving, Maleficent style, furious that they haven't been invited, cursing the child. You get there are even echoes of things like there are these warrior guardians appointed to look over the child in the same way that there are 3 fairies in the Disney Princess. Now, not only do I not claim to be an expert in Central African folklore, I don't really claim to be an expert in European folklore, but I think some of that is even not in the original Sleeping Beauty. That's a kind of Disney embellishment. So I just wondered if there's a miasma of interesting things going on in the kind of artistic stuff here.
All right, I'll try to keep this brief because I'm not an expert either.
Right. We all claim we're not experts.
About 6 months ago.
I actually am.
You're an expert. Right. But listeners, if we're wrong, do write in and we'll,
So first of all, so much of the Disney catalog is based on Grimm's fairy tales and
Perrault
and things like that. About 6 months ago, I was in the Republic of Georgia, former Soviet country, but it's one of the oldest cultures, the Caucasus. That's where we get the word Caucasian. And I'm standing at a temple that was, I don't know what year it was, but it was maybe 200 AD, something like that. And there is a Celtic cross there. And I'm thinking to myself, why is there a Celtic cross in the in the Caucasus, right? Yeah. This bridge between Asia and Europe. Sure. And Iran is close to Iran, it's close to the northern Africa and things like that. The point really is that these stories really do come up out of that part of the world, up through the Caucasus and into Europe. And so the question might be better, what did Disney borrow from the African American folk?
Quite. Yes, you're quite right. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Quite. Well, yeah. We're definitely not going to have a conversation about what the original of these stories are, because that's a futile conversation. I was just curious as to
I don't even know the answer.
I was curious as to whether Collins, given you said about Disney and things like that, whether he was thinking about this as a kind of anti-Disney fairy tale, or as in any way in relationship to
my educated sense, but not factual knowledge, is that I don't think he would give Disney the time of day enough to even consider going after Disney in any way.
Great, that's a good answer. Okay, so let's talk about the thing itself. Yes, it's. I mean, this is like it's largely still images, isn't it? There's a few embellishments of the still images, but this is where we can talk about whether illustration is this a better word for this? Is that another problematic word that we don't want to use? Chris,
I had kind of thinking about camera movements, and I was struck by, I think it's this film that has the credit for cameraman and an assistant cameraman, and I thought, that's interesting that I wouldn't have necessarily. I would need to scrutinise my animated credits. But the idea of a cameraman. So anyway, I was struck by the fact that, I show with my students the 1932 film Plain Dumb, which has a very similar opening insofar as it's like a kind of it's Tom and Jerry, but it's not that Tom and Jerry. And it's a couple of, it's from the Van Buren studio, and it's a story that sort of begins with these two characters that are white characters in a plane, and they fly over Africa, and the sort of point of view shot is a map. It's just a draw, and it just says Africa, and it's like, how you would imagine a Hollywood studio in the 1930s to depict the outline, but it's more from the sort of the bird's eye view of just this sparse map with a couple of palm trees.
That's all one thing. Yeah.
That's all one thing. Then the characters decide to adopt blackface, and the moment that they do, their voice changes and they start to kind of speak in a specific way. I was struck by the opening of this because it also begins. It sort of begins with this far away land in Africa, and then you have maps, and then you have that really interesting moment where it cuts in photographs of Martin Luther King. I think there's a couple of other people I didn't recognize, and I was like, "Oh, this is interesting." It's defining this place through lineage but history and influence and culture and the arts and all this sort of stuff. And I was struck by this very regressive film from the 1930s about how to introduce a specific that's all the same part of the world. And this really interesting, nuanced, and then on top of that you've got camera movement, you've got very rare, if any, lip movements in the film. It's just sort of done through voiceover. And then I found myself writing down, this is just kind of still images used to create movement. And then I thought, yeah, that's just animation though, isn't it? Still images used to create movement. So I was thinking, this is a really distilled version of what animation does. It's like anime in that sense, the way that Tom Lamar talks about anime. Backgrounds are physically moved where the characters stay the same. So and it makes me going back to what you said about movement, basketball and sport, and thinking about in quite granular detail how bodies move, and so I think from a stylistic perspective, I just put this is like all animation. There's no in betweening, but it's done in this really it's legible. Like it's not. I suppose legibility is another term when we think about like the way stories are told. Why does it need to have in betweens? Why does it need to have this kind of fluid? So I think from a sort of stylistic perspective, it's super interesting the way it doesn't have the lip movements, it doesn't kind of use space in the kind of quote unquote classical way, and I love that about the film, and the kind of beautiful drawings and the colors as well, the kind of color scheme. I don't want to over orientalize what the film is doing, but it's definitely doing some interesting stuff.
Yeah, well, it was also designed to be direct to video. So in the 90s, I know working in New York in the 90s, there was a lot of animation like that done for direct to video, and the budgets just weren't there.
Sure.
So even if they wanted to do more in between and stuff like that, I don't think they could. But I don't think that was the point. And I think some of the intellectual interesting thing is, does animation have to move?
Yeah.
Does animation have to move?
Well, and I'll throw in a complication I've done on the podcast before and in private conversation with Chris.
Vintage
Actually, you mentioned the thing about the cameraman. It almost always is moving. It's not the image that's moving, but the way it's filmed. It's either panning in or panning out. So actually, there's almost always movement in the frame. It's just not provided in the in between. It's not in the frame by frame.
But then we're getting into your work as well on kind of animatronics and something that I've talked about with. There's an article that I've co-written. Well, I've done very little in this co-written piece, but it's about an animator who works with animatronics and trying to submit their work to a film festival. In the animation category said it's not animation, and the live action category said, well, this is animation, isn't it? So, and then we've talked on the podcast previously when you said about computer
animation. This is my provocative sentence of the podcast. I think live action. I think filmed live action puppetry should count as animation,
like the Henson stuff. And
so you mentioned Henson. I think the Muppet Show is animation.
So
I think all film is animation.
Well, I think we have it wrong.
Now,
but going back to the in-between stuff. So when we've talked about computer animation, that there's no real in-betweens in computer animation. It's because you program a point A and a point B, and then the computer kind of fills. So computer animation isn't frame by frame in that. So and
3D animation is also on a flat screen.
So here we go. So
we've just destroyed the premise of the podcast. Given us a whole lot more to talk about.
Welcome to the next episode of Fantasy /
Everything.
Yeah, everything. But I think it's the point about this movement. I am really interested in what you said about this kind of movements, motion studies as well. When you mentioned Collins as well, animation is not the illusion of life, but it's the study of motion, however that occurs. So I can study this film through movement. The drawings don't have to move in the same way, but I'm studying it through that kind of rubric or that. So I think that's a really interesting kind of paradigm that you set up, this sort of motion studies, which is obviously familiar from maybe the industry itself and Disney doing these quote motion studies, but this is not that kind of motion study. It's almost happening in perception. The spectators thinking about movement when they watch it because of what animation is.
Well, I think this is fascinating. What is the camera? The camera is the audience. Camera is the audience, and actually is the most important character. because those are the eyes through which the audience experiences this. So yes, your camera moves. That's all animation.
Well, it's animating the image, isn't it? It's,
in some form, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, we are really running out of time. Can you just fill in the story of sort of T. Collins towards the end of his life, and let's put a full stop, if we can, on this wonderful kind of rich...
A colon.
Yeah. And then we'll talk about how people can learn more about this.
So in 2000, Collins was given a celebration for his career. He was still alive, and there's video of this. It was held at the Schomburg, and he insisted it be held in Harlem. Mm-hmm. And so many animators came out, Congress people came out to this thing. He was so well known in Harlem, and so people were worried about would their cars get broken into coming up to Harlem, things like that. Mm-hmm. And T just said no, because he knew everybody, and they watched over the block and everything. So by the end of his life, he was lecturing. He did a lecture with Grant Munro, who we know from the Film Board and his work with McLaren and so forth. So he was right. Lecturing on culture and animation at a very high academic level by the end of his life, and died not too much longer than that after that, but has left a legacy of students. And I think one of the reasons I'm so passionate about this is because what an amazing story here. You have somebody who came up against so many odds in an industry that was not going to accept, and his intellectual approach to animation and culture brings so much to the table. Brings so much.
You've touched on so many different people that he seems to have had contact indirectly with or directly with that traverse, Linda Semensky, McLaren. He's absolutely embedded, as you said earlier, kind of essential to the way we think about animation and the development, and all these kind of through lines and connectives, that it seems a real shame that his work and himself has been neglected, and obviously your work is trying to recover.
We're trying to one last thing, Howard Beckerman, who just passed away last year. Anyone in New York knows Howard Beckerman. He was taught one of the first history of animation classes for college credit anywhere, 40 years at School of Visual Arts. We're talking about Disney animators, Hanna-Barbera animators. Tom Cito is a student, Vet Kaplan. I was a student. He influenced so many animators, but he was encouraged by T. Collins specifically to start his own studio. So this reverberation from T. Collins into the world of Hollywood and into the world of animation at large is really important, and yes, really important for people to recognize, for sure.
Brilliant, amazing. Okay, so that was wonderful, really was. And I learned a lot today. But I'm hungry to learn more. So
this is just up your street as well, Alex, isn't it? This kind of recovery, acts of recovery,
handwritten letters. I've been in my element. But if there are kind of two projects. One's sort of you're just about to start, if you're happy to talk about it, but the other one is out probably when this podcast is out.
The New York book.
So tell us about the New York books to start with.
New York is it's called New York Animation 1966 to 1999, A City in Motion. It's really about, Linda Semensky writes the foreword to this book.
Right.
She's been amazing. I interviewed everybody I could get my hands on, from George Griffin to John Canemaker to Ralph Bakshi to Jim Simon. There's a full chat. So it's all about New York, and I guess the through line is that, coming from UPA, into this auteur animation, how animation today has been so influenced by New York, whereas we sort of look towards Hollywood or Japan. That's coming out, I think, August 25th. That will be out. And there's a whole chapter. It's called "This Chapter is Brought to You by the Letter T." And it's from what I know, the first written chapter in any book about the legacy of T. Collins and Jim Simon and Dan Haskett, those three Harlem animators. And then I'm working with the Collins family to co-author a book tentatively titled "The Man Who Worked Magic," because that was his advertising phrase. to talk about the life and legacy of T. Collins, and so that's currently in progress.
Great.
Okay, amazing. So listeners, wherever you are in whatever time space, check out both those projects if they're around. But obviously, check out the New York book, which is available when this podcast is out.
Yes,
I will be. So I encourage you all to do the same.
Thank you, Robbie. Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you for giving voice to this amazing story.
Lots of other people gave voice to it. We just
loudspeaker.
plugged in a microphone and asked you some inane questions for an hour or two, but it was our pleasure to do so. I feel like I'm on Sesame Street now, but this episode was brought to you by the Animation Studies, Society of Animation
The
Studies.
letters S, A, and S.
The letters SAS, indeed, which is where we are, the conference. We're grateful for them for hosting us and allowing us space to record and allowing this episode to happen. If you want to know more about the Society of Animation Studies, you can find it at animationstudies.org, animationstudies.org. You can also find us at fantasy-animation.org, where you can find an archive of blogs and podcasts. You can contact us via the tab there, or you can email us at fananimresearch, FANANIM research @gmail.com, and we'll happily hear suggestions, feedback, or any other kind of part of the conversation that we try to evoke and provoke each week. Otherwise, we'll see you next time.
Bye.